talk about each one of those here in a little bit. So we're recording now, and this is the Unit 4 webinar for EDSP 5315. And there are a couple of overlaps tonight in the behavior chapter, chapter 12, the last chapter that we'll discuss. There are some overlaps with the behavior class, the second class that we had in the spring semester, for those of you that may have had me for 5311 in the spring. And a few of you, let's see, Jean Ann was in that. Summer, were you in that class? 5311 in the second half.
The one with both the doctors, Kevin?
Where Dr. Mr. Kevin was in there with me.
Oh yeah, yeah, that was a fun class.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Jessica, I think you were in that class too, right?
Yeah, I think you were.
Yes,
And that was too, Rhonda, you were not in there. And no, Becky, and it was too early for our Granbury girls. Lindsay wasn't in there yet. There is a little bit of overlap in that chapter that we're going to do tonight with that class. And so there'll be a couple things where I will say, some of y'all may remember this. So I'll hit that a couple of times a little bit later. But those of you who didn't have it in the spring may, if you're in the diagnostician program, you will have to take that next spring. So there may be some themes that you'll remember next spring that will help you. So I have a PowerPoint that I put together just to hit on, just kind of basically to remind me of some of the high points, and then I'll post it later to help y'all maybe remember some of these things that we'll touch on. And Rhonda, I don't know if I responded to your email or not, but I realized that I made a mistake on something that affected you and maybe other people. And if it did, I'll correct it, but I know it affected you because you sent me an email about it. And I don't think I responded to you. But on last week's quiz, there was a question that said something about, I can't remember what the content was, but I think it was something about sampling. And then it said, is it answer, is it this one or this one, or is it answer 1 and 2 or something like that? And the problem with that one is that in a previous iteration of that quiz, it was set up so that the answers were in the same order every time. And this time, when I added the new bonus question, I told it to scramble the answers. And I didn't think about there being one that it mattered if the answers were in the same order or not. And on that particular question, it did matter if the answers were in a particular order, because they weren't named, A, B, C, or D. And that answer mattered what order they were in. And so I'll go back and see if that radically impacted anybody. And if it did, I'll correct that for you and just, give you that answer. Because that was my error in changing the rules on that one, basically. Okay. So Rhonda, that's the answer to that question, if I haven't answered you on paper or, in email. And I don't think I got around to that. You may tell, did I answer you that on paper? Okay. I didn't think I had, but it was a pretty wild weekend. I've been at my mom's since last Friday, and I'm here now. And she's watching TV in there. So we'll see if y'all can hear it. I'm not sure what's on right now, but something exciting, I'm sure. But my husband, Clark, he's in the other room with her right now. And so maybe he can handle any eventuality. So let's see. What I want to do is I want to share my screen for a minute. And I've got a PowerPoint that I put together with some topics that I want to discuss. And so we'll go over these things. Okay, can everybody see my PowerPoint? Okay. We're going to talk about chapters 10, 11, and 12 briefly, and then we'll talk about what we've got due this week and next week. Okay, chapter 10 is about inclusive environments. So let's just begin by talking for a second about what IDEA says about inclusive environments as they pertain particularly to students with significant disabilities. Can anybody tell me that? This
You're
is a new
supposed to
section.
have them with the general population as much as possible. Like
That's
that's the
right.
idea is we want
Mhm.
to have them exposed to their peers, to their average peers as much as we possibly can.
right.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
the exact verbiage is to the maximum extent appropriate. To
Mhm.
the maximum extent appropriate. And what I did was I kind of threw you off a little bit there by saying this particular subpopulation. And that's really a diversion because the verbiage is the same for every disability. Okay. Every disability is entitled to placement in the general education environment or with their general ed peers to the maximum extent appropriate. Now, those of you who are planning to be diagnosticians need to learn that by memory. And even those of you who are going to be special education teachers need to know this by memory, because you may be called upon to be the one to advocate for a student in an ARD committee meeting when perhaps your campus administrator says, okay, well, this student is, has a significant disability. They need to go in a life skills class. That's where all of our kids with severe disabilities go. They always go in a life skills class. And that's not what IDEA says. It says all students are to be educated in the general education setting to the maximum extent appropriate. So there is a question on our practice exam for diagnosticians that starts off with, and Summer and Jean Ann already know this because they've had that practice exam. So this is to the benefit of those of you who on the screen who are going to be taking that practice exam next spring. And that question basically says, we have a student with a new evaluation and they've been determined to be intellectually disabled. And the ARD committee is looking to place that student, and where should they be placed? And all of the information in that question basically says that the student would be appropriately placed in a life skills class. And that's one of the answers, but that's the wrong answer, because that's not supposed to be our first default placement. Our first default placement is always the general ed environment, even when we all know, if we've been in ARD committees, on ARD committees and in meetings, that that's not what ARD committees usually do. We know that ARD committees put kids where other kids like them are. And that's the reality. But that's not what IDEA says to do. And that's not what children are entitled to. Children are entitled to placement with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. Now, where it gets tricky is that last word of what I just said, and that's appropriate. What's appropriate? And what we talk a lot about in the diagnostician program is appropriate can be interpreted in lots of different ways by lots of different people. And what I think is appropriate, and what that student's parent thinks is appropriate, and what that student's teacher thinks is appropriate, and what that campus principal thinks is appropriate can look very, very different.
Mhm.
And that's where things get tricky. And sometimes you have to be the voice of reason and the voice of the reminding voice of the law, what the law actually says about this, to bring ARD committees back to center and say, okay, what does IDEA tell us we have to do? And we've got to think about the maximum extent appropriate and place the child there in general ed with non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. Now, when a parent says to us, I want my child in general ed all day, every day, no negotiation, that may not be appropriate. But when the campus principal says to us, life skills all day, every day, that may not be the maximum extent or the minimum extent appropriate. You know, we've got to figure out what's appropriate. And that's where evaluation comes in. That's where our present levels of performance come in. And we've got to figure out how to make it work appropriately. So the child is entitled to that maximum extent appropriate with non-disabled peers. And your book talks about, in my loose leaf text, it was on page 211, I believe. But it's in chapter 10, it's figure 10.2. And it's called the Program Quality Measurement Tool, or abbreviated the PQMT. There is a question on your quiz about the PQMT. And it's an assessment tool that's used to help districts, campuses, etc., determine practices that are research-based and inclusive in nature. And it's got, I think it's 44 different measures that the district can look at and ask themselves, how are we doing with research-based measures on this particular factor for using research-based inclusive practices in our district at the district level, and then at the campus level, and then all the way down to the student level. How are we using those research-based and verified practices to include students with significant disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate on our campuses and in our classrooms in our district? And it's a really good tool. I must say, I haven't seen too many districts that use an objective tool to self-analyze how well they're doing at using research-based strategies to make these determinations. If you find yourself in a district that that doesn't include students with significant disabilities in general ed settings very often, it might be advisable to share this tool, or I was about to say one like it, but I don't know of any others like it. So this tool, or a link to it, or even just this page out of your textbook with the leadership in your district, to show a very objective view of how a district can evaluate their use of good strategies, verifiable strategies to appropriately include students with significant disabilities into inclusive settings with fidelity. And so the PQMT is a tool to help districts analyze their use of that, and then put those more inclusive practices into place.
And Dr. Kevin, when I was reading chapter 10, one thing that kind of stuck out in my brain is they were emphasizing, inclusion, maximum extent, everything. But then there was like one little part where it said, but, in some situations, of course, it's up to the ARD committee to make the ultimate decision. So I like how they kind of slid that in there, like, IDEA is pushing for as much as possible, but ultimately it is an ARD committee decision. So
Right. And it is always the ARD committee decision. And I think it's always important to remember, appropriate is the key word there. And so, as I like to say in class, there are some students for whom appropriate means a lot of time down the hall in a segregated setting. And we're not just talking about students with significant intellectual disabilities or significant physical disabilities. Sometimes we're talking about students with significant behavioral issues or emotional issues, some of those kinds of things that may keep them out of the general population. And sometimes that means all day. But
And I actually had a situation this last school year where a parent was adamant about having her student go into a more restrictive environment. He was in resource and gen ed classes. And prior to coming to our school, he had been primarily in a life skills setting.
mhm,
However, his testing showed that he was capable of being in a more least restrictive environment. But
mhm.
the mom was like, if y'all don't do this, then I'm taking further action. And there was like 30 people in the staffings and everything because the mom was so adamant about getting him back into life skills because she didn't want him to have the pressures of the content. I guess she was like, it's stressing him out and everything like that. So it is interesting how each ARD meeting, each situation is very individualized. And like you said, you have to look at the big picture and you
Mhm.
have to look at all the aspects because
Very true.
every student is so different and what they bring to the table, you know?
Absolutely. Good point. I'm glad you brought that up because it can go both ways. All right. So a few other terms that you'll see in your quiz and in your textbook are collaborative teaming, critical to having students with significant disabilities be successful in general ed settings is this teaming approach. So starting at a more global level and then working down to the classroom. So starting at the district level and then working to the campus level so that all those supports are in place and making sure that everybody is on board and lots of things are managed at each level so that everybody is, like I say, on the same page and the family is involved, the administration is involved, the paraprofessionals are involved, the teachers are involved, etc. All of our support personnel, so that we have a successful effort at inclusion. So we've got this collaborative teaming, then we've got the planning that has to go into meaningful inclusion. As we've talked about, we talked about this a few weeks ago when we talked about team teaching. It does require a lot of effort. Somebody talked about their efforts at team teaching and how much planning does go on behind the scenes. And this is certainly true when we talk about including a child with significant disabilities in general education. It requires a lot of planning before that actual time in the classroom ever takes place. So there are those curricular supports. There's personnel supports that occur behind the scenes. There's all those technical supports that take place. We've got to look at adaptations. We've got to look at modifications. We've got to look at augmentations, maybe actual alterations to the curriculum, maybe alterations to the physical setting, to the classroom itself. So lots of things have to happen on the front end before we can make that effort at inclusion really successful. And I think this is the reason why a lot of campus administrators would just rather us take our kids with significant disabilities on down the hallway and make it all happen in the special ed setting, because it's easier. It's just cleaner to make it all happen down the hall in one classroom, where you don't have to have every room modified. You don't have to have every room altered. And I can see that from an administrative standpoint, but it certainly isn't to the most benefit to the child to have children with more significant disabilities segregated all day long. They do benefit from socialization. They do benefit from communication opportunities with other children. And so we want to make that available as much as possible, even though it may require and does require a lot of pre-planning. So what barriers are there to inclusion of students with severe disabilities? There is a question about this on your quiz, and it's related to the one barrier that's the biggest, and that's the grown-ups that are involved, and the grown-ups that are on the educating side of things. We're the ones who stand in the way the most, and our attitudes toward it.
Yeah, because it's if you don't have the perception that students with significant disabilities can succeed in the general ed curriculum, then full inclusion is not going to work.
You're
You know,
exactly
it's not
right.
going to, yeah.
Exactly right. Absolutely. And that's the greatest barrier right there, is when you don't have educators with an attitude of that's success oriented, then you've got a propensity toward failure right there at the very beginning. Okay, any other questions about chapter 10 before we move on to chapter 11? Chapter 11 is about communication, and communication is a social behavior. That's how we engage with other people. And not all communication is oral or verbal. Either word you want to use there, oral or verbal. It's often done in nonverbal ways. It can assist in behavior regulation. It can assist in lots of ways with the things that we need from students in our classrooms, in developing maturity in our students. How do we begin by evaluating where our students are with their communication? How can we do that effectively with students who have significant disabilities? Well, the very best way is in naturalistic settings. We talked earlier in the semester about something called ecological inventories, and that's I think that's the word that's used on your quiz to describe these naturalistic kinds of evaluations, where we take a student where they are and we do an evaluation in that setting to determine the function of their language, and not just their oral language, because like I say, many of these students don't have oral language, but their communication, however they're communicating. And it may be with gestures, it may be symbols, it may be with some aided systems. Some of you who have worked with students who have more significant disabilities may have used some of these aided systems. It may be a picture replacement system. Probably the most popular of those is called PECS, and PECS stands for Picture Exchange Communication System, PECS, PECS. And in another week or two, Meredith, my daughter, will be with us, and she'll give us some examples of some of those kind of things that she's used in her classroom. And those of you who have used those will have lots of experience with that. Your book has a few examples of those. But we also have
What it stands for again? I'm sorry. Picture exchange.
Picture Exchange Communication System, I believe is what the S is for. PECS, PECS. And all of our
Oh, I put a K there. I put
Oh.
P-E-C-K. I was trying to figure out the K. But
C is for communication.
okay, got it.
But our speech pathologists do most of the work with that. And then that's a very specific system, but there are a lot of other systems that are very individualized, and Meredith will talk with us about that. But we don't have to use a published system, one that's cranked out by a corporation or a publishing company. You can make a communication system that works with the student that you're working with. If you want to have a picture exchange system, you don't have to use the one that's published by that particular company. We usually begin with something that's an exact replication of the object that we want to represent. So a photograph is the very best representation. And then after that, it would be, like a drawing or a picture of that thing. And then after that would be more like an icon. As the child learns the representation, we can move further and further away of the exact picture. But to begin with, if we want to give the child an opportunity to select an apple or an orange, we would want to have a photograph of an apple and an orange, because that way we know that they're picking either an apple or an orange. And then as they've learned those two pictures, the actual photographs, we can move to a drawing of an apple or an orange. And then we can move to an icon of an apple or an orange.
I've
And
actually had to use the object.
the object, right, that would be the very first thing you would use. Thank you for bringing me to that, Rhonda. You're exactly right. The actual object would be the first representation. To ask a child, do you want this or this? You would show them the actual thing. Do you have anything more you can say about that for communication methods?
That was probably the hardest case I worked with. And I worked one-on-one with the parent and the assistive technology guru. I can't remember what her actual title was. I always called her my guru.
Mm-hmm.
But she and I and the parent worked to where we had a really simple system of just objects to work with their son until he finally caught on. And we were towards the end of my career there in the autism department anyway. They were just starting to introduce pictures, but he was still having a hard time making that generalization from one to the other.
Good. I'm glad you took me back to the actual objects. And then we've got augmentative and alternative communication devices that we can get up to. But the child that you're talking about, I'm sure wasn't there yet and might not ever get there. We have some students who are so low functioning that they may always need that tangible actual object. And if they can move up, they move up to a picture representation. They might not ever get to where they can use some of the more sophisticated measures. Some of the alternative or augmentative communication devices may be as simple as the big button, where a child can just tap a big button or something like that to give a yes, no, or some kind of a preference, all the way up to being able to use a sophisticated keyboard to get their communication needs conveyed. This takes me to a moment or two to discuss the video that the first video that was represented on the list of videos this week with the communication systems that the students are using. And they're all gathered around a table. And I'm not really sure if they're with their parents there or if they're with teachers or assistants or whatever. I don't know if you all have had an opportunity to watch that first video. It's, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes long. And it's a little frustrating to watch because there's just a cacophony of noise and lots of adult conversation going on. And there's, some student noise as well, but it's assisted communication where the students they all have a keyboard of some sort, and they're getting a lot of hand over hand assistance to manage their keyboards. How many of you have had a chance to watch that? Okay, 3, 3 or 4 of you. It's interesting to me to watch that, because at first glance, I always think, well, this is worthless. You know, there is nothing worthwhile going on in this video at all. But the more you really look at it, and the more you talk to people who spend a lot of time with individuals who have been successful with augmentative communication devices, the more you learn that perhaps what it takes is that kind of practice over and over and over and over, and that errorless learning that we talked about last week, where they are getting that hand over hand practice with somebody basically doing it for them. The thing that strikes me in that video, there's one young man who is not even looking at the keyboard while the lady behind him is, moving his hand, and he's looking off, this direction while someone is moving his hand over the keyboard. And you think, as you're watching it, well, that's useless. He's not even attending to what's happening on the keyboard. But what he may be getting is maybe some muscle memory to move toward the keyboard. Maybe it's just the first steps of learning what that's going to be like for him eventually, to learn to key in some letters. I've talked to so many people who have had success with students with this type of communication that say, this is just the very beginning. You've got to have a lot of these kind of experiences. You've got to have a lot of hand over hand instruction before you ever get to more independent communication with students with more significant disabilities. So what do y'all think about that? Any
I
feedback?
wanted to add something, Dr. Cavan.
Please do.
In my resource classes, I've had students that are ID, and the way we would kind of start our class is a good thing, but I would have them write it. And so at the beginning, I would do a lot of modeling, my good thing is, and most of the students would need a lot of assistance with spelling. And so anyone from the general ed realm would probably come in and be like, man, she's just doing everything and they're just copying. But honestly, by the end of the year, my ID kit, because we did it every single day, it was systematic, it was repetition, I was over teaching it.
Right.
They were able to write that first sentence on their own for the most part. And so I totally understand what you're talking about, how that hand over hand and doing it, and you're thinking, oh, they're not getting anything. But actually, they are, because it's just really hard for the typical person to kind of, you have to think of it in a different way,
Right.
know, because they think differently than we do. And so
Yeah.
it's just kind of one of those things where you have to train your brain to know that this is not the general ed population. And there is a reason that we're doing this repetitive over teaching, and there is some success, and we won't see it overnight. It's going to take time. But when you just said that about the hand over hand, that made me think of that, because my co-teacher, she's only been teaching 2 years, and not co-teacher, the other resource teacher. And she was like, well, I just feel like you're like spoon feeding them. And I said, well, at the beginning you have to model a lot, and you kind of have to do the same pattern, especially with our kids with the lower IQs. And so she saw by the end of the year, oh wow, these kids are writing, and so that was really exciting.
That's cool. I'm glad you shared that, Summer. Thank you.
One of the things that I talked about in my discussion post actually was, I talked about that the video had it relies very heavily on the educators. And so I suggested a better electronic augmentative An alternative communication device I would recommend would be a voice output communication aid, which speaks of the icons and like the pictures and the words in order to communicate, which kind of helps relieve the over-reliance of the hand over hand maneuvering of the teacher for the student. So that way the student can be able to work on using the device to communicate better.
Good. Thank you, Becky. Anybody else? Okay, I've got a question here on the screen. I think there's a question very much like this on your quiz. How do teachers inadvertently limit communication opportunities for students with more severe disabilities?
Would it be that they do all the talking for them?
I think that's right along the right track. I think your book calls it preempting. They preempt them. And don't we do that with lots of kids?
Yeah, I was thinking about little kids have older siblings.
Yeah.
Sometimes it takes them longer to talk because the
You're
older
ex-
siblings talk for them.
You're exactly right. I was
Yeah.
thinking the very same thing. My older two did that to their little brother. They preempted him on everything. And so he didn't have much opportunity to learn to talk because the big two were doing it for him. Okay, that takes us over to chapter 12 then. And in chapter 12, we've got behavior. Now, this is where we have some overlap with the behavior class. The ABC analysis that we had in our behavior class, that's antecedent behavior and consequence analysis that you have in any analysis of behavior. And I'm digging around my notes here. Just forgive me for a minute. What did I write down about that? Oh, there's a question on your quiz about that. Whether that's related to indirect or direct assessment. So we all think about that. I'm not going to give you the answer, but think about that. Oops, let me go back a slide.
So do you want to hear what we think it is or not right now?
If you want to tell me.
I would think it would be, well, okay, so you're observing the behavior, you're documenting it, you're writing down what happened prior to, what the actual behavior is, and then what happened right after.
Yeah.
So, direct. So,
Does that sound more direct or indirect?
well, to me, since you're gathering data and you're not actually like, I don't know, I would say direct, but
Well, it sounds pretty direct to me, Summer.
yeah, I think so.
I think so too.
Sometimes you told me this before. Sometimes don't think about it too much.
That's right. Now, let's talk for a minute about ABA. That's applied behavior analysis. And those of you who are in the DIAG program, particularly Summer and Jean Ann, who've already gone through most of it with me, y'all know more about ABA because we've talked about it more. And if you've been in the behavior class, we talked about it some in there. That was the second video that we had in this week's video selections. The woman is doing an ABA demonstration there in the floor with the little boy. And if you haven't watched it, it's like 2 minutes or so with the child. And I think it's a really good, quick overview of just a snapshot of what ABA looks like. If you're not familiar with applied behavior analysis, it's it's grown in its popularity in the last, I don't know, 15 or 20 years for use with kids with autism. And for a while there, maybe 10, 15 years ago, parents were coming to school districts and demanding ABA, 40 hours of ABA provided by the school district. Well, you can't do 40 hours of ABA when you're only in school, fewer hours than that every week. So some parents would bring their child to school for part of the day and then take their child out for part of the day for private ABA therapy. I have a particular opinion about ABA therapy. I'm not a huge fan. I think this video is a pretty good demonstration of why I'm not a huge fan. The little boy sounds rather robotic as he's giving his answers. I mean, a couple of times he even just repeats the question back that he's asked. He doesn't give an appropriate response. He just repeats the question that she's asked him. So I think those are indicators that he's not being taught conversation. He's being taught repetition. And
Well, and she was rewarding with food too, which the book was like, don't do food for rewards, because that's like, you shouldn't withhold that from someone.
I agree.
Because that's one of your like basic human rights.
I
Like
agree
that's taking
completely.
dignity away from the child.
And-
So,
and
and,
that's
and I hadn't really thought about that till I read it in the book. So,
completely. In general.
Hold on, can you repeat that? Because your sound was cutting out like at the beginning of your sentence.
I realized what I did. I picked up my AirPods, and when I did, it activated them. So, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I think that Jean Ann is exactly right with her comment there, and that's one of my big problems with it. I talked last week a little bit about the operant conditioning of my dogs and how we have trained Molly and Maddie to, sit and stay and speak and all of those things. And to me, this has a lot of that flavor to it. I almost feel like children who have gone through ABA have been trained the way we've trained our dogs. And it is very off-putting to me. I do
That's
understand.
what I saw too.
What did you say?
That's what I saw too. My boys, they love to watch animal videos. And so we watched tons of animal videos and training like monkeys and stuff. And the way she was training him was the same way that monkeys are trained. And it doesn't seem right.
Exactly.
she just
And-
needed that clicker, right?
Exactly.
You're talking about the clicker, then treat, click, then treat. Yep.
Exactly. And she even reaches into the little treat bag and then hands him the treat and then he pops it in his mouth, very much like the monkey. And I find it very off-putting because he's, he's a little boy. He's not an animal. And I'm very turned off by it. And I know I've told this to some students already, but this is all based on the research and the so forth of Ivar Lovaas, who did his research and his testing on children with autism back in the 60s and 70s. And I saw a video on it when I was doing my undergrad in the late 70s. And I was absolutely horrified at what I saw in this video. And Dr. Lovaas was out in California, and these kids were pretty disabled with autism. And this was back before autism was even in the DSM diagnostic manual for psychology and psychiatry. And but they were beginning to call it autism. And they were still using aversives. And so when a child would not respond the way, and it was the exact same sort of thing that you saw in this video, except for the use of aversives. And when the child did not give the proper response, he would slap them. And then his graduate students would do the same thing. And this was at one of the universities in Southern California. I don't remember if it was UCLA or USC, but it was one of the universities in Southern California. And it was so jarring to see an adult whack a child with a disability for not responding appropriately to a stimulus. I'll never forget sitting there in my university class and just, we were all special educators in training. I was an undergrad and I just gasped like that. And we were told it was this up and coming training. And this was Ivar Lovaas. And he was the founder of this stuff right here. Now they've taken away the aversives, the negative, the punishments that go along with this. And they've just kept in the positives, but it's the same principle. And to me, it's very much like dog training. And I'm really turned off by it. I think that parents flock to it because it gets children who have been very, very out of control, under control. And it gives some tiny bit of semblance of normal behavior to a child who maybe wasn't showing any normal behavior, a child who was screaming and head banging and things like that. And then suddenly, well, I shouldn't say suddenly, after a time, they're not head banging and they're not screaming. They're sitting and they're getting a treat in their mouth and they're saying, that's a red car. That's a blue box. That's a yellow sun, that, and they're speaking in language, or before they've been, rocking and stimming, and parents think it's a miracle. What has been noted though, is that if you go very long without doing exactly that, with those prompts and those rewards out of a little bag with increasing amounts, the behaviors stop. And so I'm not sure what we're working toward. We're working toward kids, repeating back little words and getting a piece of candy in their mouth. It's like a trained seal.
But isn't it true that like the American Pediatric Association, like they really stand behind the ABA for children with autism? I think I remember learning about that in the behavior classroom. Like this is like the like for students with autism, ABA is like the standard.
I don't know that that's so true right now. I'm going to need to do some reading on that.
Change it.
I'm not sure that that's as true as maybe it was at one point.
Okay. Maybe like on some of their ABA websites, for marketing reasons, they have all these little, like quotes from organizations or not the federal government, but like that sound like they're so like.
And it would be really interesting for somebody to do their research paper on ABA and tell us more about it. Behavior therapy, this is your bonus question for this week. There's an article that I want you to read about, it's not very long, on your list of things to do this week about behavior therapy. Behavior therapy, the bonus question asks you whether or not it has its foundations in Skinner or Sullivan, and that's Annie Sullivan, the teacher of Helen Keller. And there are some similarities to the way she taught Helen Keller, but as the article tells you, it's based on B.F. Skinner's research. And Skinner, there's a whole lot of similarity to ABA there. A little bit more, maybe there's more language oriented in behavior, verbal behavior verbal behavior therapy. There's more reliance on the development of actual words. But there's words at ABA too. The little boy was using words and putting them together in sentences. I don't think that he necessarily, attached a lot of meaning to them. And verbal behavior therapy tries to put more function, I think, with the words. But it's all attached to B.F. Skinner's theory of operant conditioning. And that's, back to the way we train a dog to, ring the bell, that kind of thing, and the little mouse and so forth. If you think back to maybe Psychology 101. We're running out of time, so I'm going to move on. Then the last slide is about our research topics. So I want you to start thinking about that. You have a research paper that's due, I think, the second to the last week or so of the class. So start thinking about your research topic. Here are just a few to consider. This by no means is an exhaustive list. You don't have to use anything off of this list. You don't have to be limited to this list or, choose anything from this list. So if you've got something that you're particularly interested in that does apply to this population, it does need to apply to this population. So be thinking of something either from this list if you can't think of anything, or something that's broader than that if you are interested in a topic beyond this list. There's a descriptor in the syllabus that talks about the research paper. And I think it'd be great if you chose something that really interests you, so that you'd be intrigued by the research that you choose to do. This week, your choice assignments are due. Any questions?
Yes, Dr. Cavan, there's on our calendar, it shows that activity 3 is also due this week, but maybe that's supposed to be for next weekend.
I think that's next week. Do I have that listed as this week?
It's listed on on the calendar for this week, but
I think that's next week.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if it has a due date for this week, then
Yeah, it has a
Yeah.
due date for this week.
it does.
Hmm.
Let me check that real quick. Let's look at that together. There's that article about verbal behavior.
Hmm.
All right, let's look at our module. Let's look at our module. Okay. Oops, I need to stop sharing that. And then let me share again, and I'll share this. Okay, now can y'all see my canvas?
Hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to scroll down here to Unit 4. We've got our reading, our videos, our discussion, our webinar, our quiz, and our choice assignment. That's all. So if it says that activity 3 is due this week, that's a mistake, and I'll go in and I'll fix that. I'll do that when we're done, okay?
Okay.
'Cause
Mhm.
that's not due this week. That will be due next week, okay?
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Thank you for bringing that to my attention, Becky.
Hmm.
See, I'm not perfect. Just when I think I'm perfect, I
You
figure
had us
out
all fooled.
I'm not. Anything else, girls?
Oh, what was the bonus thing?
It's B.F. Skinner.
Oh, okay.
Okay, it's not Annie Sullivan, it's B.F. Skinner.
Okay.
Okay, and that's 5 points. Okay. All
Sounds
right.
good.
Thank y'all for being with me tonight.
Bye.
Only 8:03. All right.
Bye.
See you next Wednesday.
See you, girls. Y'all have a good weekend. Bye.